the right pathway rather than getting to an end point and stopping. That is one of the challenges. So having thrown out all those sorts of issues for you to deliberate upon, I will now conclude and look forward to hearing the views on these issues of the other speakers. Thank you very much.
I did want to open the floor just for one or two questions. If there are questions from the audience, immediately to Jeff, before we move on to a panel discussion. Jeff's given us, I think, quite a thought-provoking talk. So if there's one or two responses that people want to give immediately to that, please, you're welcome. If not, I have a question for you, Jeff. We're moving with this kind of approach into a really complex arena, and we're saying the people advocating this approach, this landscape approach, are saying there are complex issues to be grappled with here, and we think that this landscape approach is the way to do it, and that there's, yes, a set of innovation that we need to try and tackle, a set of tools that we need to try and develop and improve. And out of that, we'll be able to handle better this complexity, well, in an era when our room for maneuver is tightening. So, is there an issue that actually there's some risk from doing that we end up making things worse in this complexity? In an approach that says we know how to handle this kind of complexity, trust us. That seems to be what you're saying. Trust us a bit. But could there be a risk attached to that?
And I think the answer is probably yes. And there's a really interesting book that was published a year or so ago by somebody called Balance about wicked environmental problems, and it's an account of how the US Forest Service did all the things that I just mentioned for years in California with budgets of millions of dollars. And their conclusion was that it was really hard to keep people's attention, that you've got a normal distribution of actors out there who care about these things. And there are people at the extreme ends of that normal distribution who care passionately and will argue forever and drive you crazy. And then there's a mass of people in the middle who really get bored out of their minds after the first few iterations and just walk away. And so Bannock concluded that finally the best solution was for the US Forest Service just to decide on its own, the way they always did do it. So I don't necessarily advocate that view, but we should not throw out the whole history of spatial planning, because a lot of spatial planning did deal with these issues, and when they made a decision, there was a legislative basis whereby it could be enforced. And I think we are in danger of straying into an area where we think everything can be done by consensus. And I think that's a dangerous area. And I do think that some of these attempts to impose complex landscape approaches on rural people in remote areas do run the danger of doing more harm than good. They might slow down the simple economic development that might actually lead to the solution to some of these problems. People are better off, better educated, healthier, have better educated children and more secure land. They sort some of these problems out. And so I think we have to be cautious, and I think, I agree with your hypothesis.
No, that wasn't my hypothesis, it was simply a question. Okay, we're going to move on to the first panel now. I think that actually sets up very nicely what we want to probe in this panel, which will come down to how do we manage the kinds of risks that Jeff's pointed out. So I want to invite up the four panelists. The first is Harry van der Linde, who's, I'll just invite him up and then introduce him. I'm sorry. Please, Harry, please take a seat. Lars Lestadius from the World Resources Institute, Stuart McGinnis, and Louise Park. Please. So, Louise, she has introduced herself already earlier this morning. Lars Lestadius from the World Resources Institute is the Senior Associate for the Forest and Landscape Restoration Program. Harry van der Linde is the Senior Director for Program Design of the African Wildlife Foundation. And Stuart Stuart McGuinness is Global Director for the Nature-Based Solutions Group for IUCN, and he also led along with colleagues, led the Livelihoods and Landscape Strategy of IUCN over the last several years, so he'll talk also about those perspectives. Now, building then upon what Jeff said, the question that each of the panelists will spend just a few minutes responding to is how does the landscape approach add value to integrating ecosystems and food security, and so start to address some of the complexities in practice terms that Jeff has raised. Perhaps I'll start with Louise.
Thanks, Mark. So I would like to spend my 4 minutes, first of all, sort of recapping what I consider from my work with Eco-Agriculture Partners to characterize the landscape approach. Essentially, we're managing agriculture and natural resources as complex socio-ecological systems. We're managing for multiple objectives. We're managing to reduce trade-offs and improve synergies across different sectors and different land uses. We're managing adaptively, and we're managing through participatory social learning and multi-stakeholder negotiation. As Jeff intimated, it didn't declare it's an extremely complex process. Cutting through all that complexity, I just want to highlight 3 applications of integrated landscape approaches that we have found to be generate very positive outcomes so far, or they're on that trajectory. One is using the landscape approach to frame and think about climate-friendly or climate-smart farming practices, especially with smallholders. We're working with funding from the CCAPS program and an action research approach with smallholder farmers, whereby they're defining ways to scale up their farm-based, what we call climate-friendly approaches to agriculture. They're developing consensus around an action research approach about how to take a landscape view to help essentially enter a much more complex environment than they do when they're dealing on their own farms. And we're finding a lot of sort of what we call social energy behind this process. So that's a stimulating positive outcome so far. We're also using the landscape framing to think about how to use climate, biodiversity, and ecosystem-oriented funding to leverage agriculture green growth, as we call it, investment strategies in large regions that are contemplating commercializing and intensifying agriculture for food security, and specifically we're working with the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, who developed what we call a green print to complement their blueprint for commercialization of agriculture. Again, framing it through a landscape type of approach so that we can help to spatially identify the way that natural resources, in particular water and wildlife, can contribute to sustainable agricultural production, and how investments in those environmental resources can complement investments in more conventional agriculture subsectors like seed supply and irrigation and so on. And then thirdly, we're using the landscape approach to probe and the concept of resilience, how we can get resilience and more resilient livelihoods and more resilient ecosystems as part of a strategy that the World Food Program is pursuing to improve food security among exceptionally vulnerable populations of people. And again, the landscape framing helps to capture these different dimensions of resilience as a way of scaling up plot and farm level interventions to landscape scale, whereby we can measure how an intervention has resilience outcomes across different sectors, across in the human dimension as well as the ecological dimension. Thank you.
Okay, Louise, thank you. Yeah, so we're hearing about that there are despite this complexity, there's some very practical tools emerging for how you start working with that sort of complexity and moving some management up to the landscape level, and complementary kinds of investment that you can bring into to start helping that happen. I want to now pass to Lars for your views on that question.
Okay. I'm a simple forester, actually, recovering forester. My message is therefore also simple, and that is that the trees can help with the food security. I take it that landscape approach is something to do with complexity and integration. And what I'm interested in is something that we start to call the mosaic landscape. The mix of people and food, which you have in many places, but also with trees. And trees here is the critical component or tool, if you like. And I'd like to address a few windmills, meaning flawed assumptions. And one such assumption is that segregation is good. This may be a northern thing where you have a lack of sunlight. You want to keep the food here and the trees there so they don't compete with each other. But in the tropics, I don't think this is necessarily the right thing to do. Another one of those issues is that food, fiber, and fuel are contradict each other, and they all need to be in separate spaces. I don't think this is true either. I think there are places where you can actually integrate them. And there's some knee-jerk things too that are harmful, saying that, well, if you now assume that trees can sometimes be a good thing, some people think that trees must always be planted. Talk about trees, you assume tree planting, this is wrong. It's not necessarily so at all. Another assumption that's out there is that to get trees, it's very expensive. You pay lots of money to invest in these trees. I don't think this is true either. There are ways for farmers to work, manage natural regeneration, possibly expensive in terms that you actually need to pay attention and know a little bit, but they are not expensive in the sense that you need to go to the bank. These are low investment and therefore locally controlled schemes that can do a great deal of good. So I think that trees can help as a simple message. And I think that we can find nice examples, bright spots of that in the dry tropics, in Israel, for example, being one of them. That I think that we ought to be thinking about how to scale up.
Okay, thank you. So this idea that we can simplify, get out of complexity, stop dealing with the complex issues, we can just simplify, as you put it, by segregating, ends up being actually counterproductive. So we can't escape. Can't escape the issue. We have to deal with the issue. We're going to tackle food security and sustainability. Harry.
Thank you very much. AWF is one of the international conservation organizations that started about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, with a landscape scale approach, what we call heartlands. So these landscapes are larger landscapes where there are public areas as national parks, forest reserves, community areas, and private pieces of land. And AWF has learned over time to see, at least tries to learn over time, how to go about planning in these landscapes. And we did it for a number of years, and about 5 years ago we started working in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of our new heartlands. And the challenge there was that in a very remote area of the DRC, the communities couldn't sell their products anymore because there was no boat that was picking up their agricultural crops that they could sell. So they had moved into the natural areas because they needed to see in one form or another to provide for their livelihoods. And what AWF had done since that time is to, together with the communities, together with local government, national government, to come up with a zoning process for that larger landscape. First on a macro level to determine where national parks and core areas for conservation ought to be, where the communities were best positioned to do agricultural activities, but also looking into the market linkage to make sure that if these farmers were producing their crops, that they could bring it to the market. And we did a kind of a gamble by hiring a barge, bringing it up to the area that the farmers could sell their crops and brought to the market. Up to now, that has worked quite well. We are facing similar challenges in what Louise already referred to in Tanzania. There is a huge program underway across more or less the center of Tanzania for huge industrial agricultural production. What is the impact on conservation and in these areas? What if we don't engage in this discussion? Coming back to your question, I mean, should we just do our traditional way of operating? And the question is, are we not beyond that point? And if we're not engaging in these discussions, other processes and developments go on and we have missed the opportunity for conservation. So based on our experience so far, I think there's a number of things that we have learned. We think as AWF that we need to plan. You need to do it at scale. You need to look into the macro level, and once you have agreed upon that, you need to bring it back to the micro level. You need to do it across sectors. It doesn't make sense for us as a conservation organization to talk to the Ministry of Environment and not look at what happens at planning and what Treasury is doing or what the Agricultural Department is doing, what happens in mining. And I think that conservation organizations are still struggling in general to do it. I'm not saying that we have found the solution, but I think we need to reach out much wider than what we have done so far. And it has to be happening in an integrated ecosystem approach. You cannot look at it as just production for agricultural purposes or for livelihoods. We're only looking at conservation. We need to look at an integrated way at these landscapes. Secondly, that we will need to engage stakeholders across the different sectors, and that we will have then to cement that in planning decisions. It doesn't make sense to sit around with a lot of different departments, agree on how you want to zone your landscape,